Ooh. Yeah, there you go. And then here we go. So I'll pull this up and I'll play from current slide. I'm hoping you all are gonna be seeing something here. Use slideshow. I mean, we could do it with the instructor's view, but I thought let's just do it this way. Okay, I hope you're all seeing something called thinking about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Carolyn.
Yeah, hi, Carolyn. While we're waiting for Carolyn, Jenny, it's really great to see you.
Hi,
And tell Homer I really appreciated his letter.
I will.
Yeah, okay. So thinking about this is the Substack site of Timothy Snyder. And he just put up a great essay on the history of Crimea. You know, it starts with the bombing of the bridge and the current stuff, but skip over that and get to the history. It's spectacular, starting with the Greeks living in Crimea. It's really good. It's all in your mailbox as an attachment. And he puts out a essay or two each week. He traveled and he met with Zelensky. He's I think I've mentioned he's lived in Ukraine, and he and Zelensky went deep on Havel, the Czechoslovakian philosopher and politician. Yeah, so this is just you go deeper, and this is the beginning of that essay. The other news sources I want to point out is Ukraine Cast. It's a BBC, about a half hour, 4 or 5 times a week. And they interviewed this guy, Orlando Figgis. He's a British historian. I'm not sure if you heard of him. Okay. No. He's just come out with a new book. He was interviewed about that, the story of Russia. And it was a great interview. So his has many other podcasts on, so I'm running all those down, and he's very good. He starts his book with the great statue face-off. So this is Vladimir the Great. In 988, he apparently was baptized, a big deal. He decided to go with Constantinople. He was in Kiev, and the Ukrainians put up a statue of him in 1853, which would have been 5 years after all those protests against the monarchy that swept Europe in 1848. So the timing is interesting, and nationalism really starts, and it overlooks the Dnieper, where there was a mass baptism. So he got baptized somewhere. Putin says Crimea. Other people say Crimea. Snyder says, we don't know. We have no way of knowing where the hell he was baptized. But in any case, by 1853, he is a part of Ukrainian nationalism. While they're still under the heel of Russia, by the way. So Putin put up his own statue in 2016, 2 years after he conquered Crimea, where he says Vladimir the Great. He wasn't a king. He was a prince. That's his official title, a grand prince or something like that. But notice the name difference. This is the difference between Russian, and Ukrainian. And it's not Vladimir Zelensky, it's Volodymyr Zelensky, but Vladimir Putin. So that's the great face-off. And this is where I turn things over to Ramsey.
Good. Can you go to slides 80, 81? Is that possible?
Oh, slide 81.
Yeah.
Sure, I can do that. So
Or,
I'm going to have to stop share. I didn't receive my, I didn't ask for my instructions. That's my bad.
I'm gonna give him full 45 minutes to cook. Let's see. 7.
Okay. I'm having a hard time seeing. I'm getting close, right?
Yeah, you're getting very close. Keep going.
81.
82 is the funny graph.
Oh,
Okay, so.
well, things have changed. Never mind. Well, that's because.
Oh, because of my slides.
Yeah.
So I bumped the, oh, geez,
Oh,
I
yeah, you
bumped
go there,
the
80, 85, 85.
85. It would
right
be
there was it.
a convincing tale.
Okay.
Okay, so now, yeah, don't take that off Ramsey's time. My bad. I should have asked about it.
We lost.
It's coming.
It's coming. We're here. Here, I got it. Okay, everyone there? I'm assuming everyone's there. If that's the case, then this is asking an awful lot from a week later, but were there any lingering questions anyone had about this absurdly quick presentation that was not quick at all, an hour, about this first thesis from Frankopan that at least from the first 2000 year period here, 500 BCE to 1500 CE, the most of human history was centered on Eurasia, on the Silk Road in particular, rather than Rome and what happened to Rome, or even China for that matter. And I'm assuming there's no lingering questions regarding all that. The average person would say, well, I didn't know much of this stuff anyway, so how could I have any questions or any challenges?
You must be a friend of John's because you're assuming a great deal. I had a question about the lack of mention of the Tibetans and the Mongol, Tibetan, Buddhist tradition, whether that figured into any of this.
Well, it does figure, it's figured but as far as, unless I've got the timeline wrong, it's at the very end. Is that not true? Where that that's not so much the tradition of Buddhism, but there is a rather nasty group that comes right out of Tibet. I mean, they're really quite violent and takes over Central Asia just about 1500 CE. And to some degree are part of the whole unraveling of Silk Road trade. Is that what you're referring to, or something else?
Well, the Tibetan oligarchy goes back to the 15th century.
Yeah.
But my understanding was that the Mongols, maybe the Kushans, I'm not sure, had occupied the Tibetan plateau earlier, and I wasn't sure how that might have played a role.
Yeah, it's a good question. No, it's not. Frankopan doesn't deal with that at all, as he doesn't deal with a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And whether he's assuming that the readers of his book knew this, or he's got a tale to tell and he's going to focus on what he wants to tell, who knows? Who knows?
Well, it probably didn't play a big role in the East-West trade. And
No, it
And
didn't.
that
It
development.
absolutely didn't. Although what I mentioned maybe 2 minutes ago was significant as far as the unraveling of Central Asia, something I just learned about 2 weeks ago myself. So we'll leave it. We'll leave it. Okay.
I'll be good.
You'll be good. You'll be good. Behave yourself. Exactly. You interrupt as you wish. Aiko's giving me 5 minutes back anyway. Okay, the second thesis that of course we're the ones identifying these theses, but I think the second giant point that Frankopan drives to home in his book is that it is, while it's quite true that the West will arrive at the absolute center of the history of civilization, somewhere after 1500 BCE, I mean CE, we call it AD, I suppose, we old timers, that that being the center of the world civilization happened really rather late. And secondly, it had almost nothing to do with the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and all that kind of stuff. And more had to do with, well, what we're just writing here, that, well, I suppose not here yet, but by and large, the West rose to its high point somewhere around 1815, 1800, because it did no better than the Mongols. It simply dominated resources around the world, and frankly, it caused a lot of pain somewhere else in Europe. So we'll go through what he has to say and see if you're somewhat convinced about that. Chapter 11, the road of gold. His argument is after the Silk Road has been opened up by the Mongols, so that all sorts of Chinese technology, compass, gunpowder, better maps. Some of those maps didn't come from China; they came from Asia itself, Islamic explorations. But once that's available to the West, and the West is quite available now of where the things they want come from, like spices, they're going to go out into the Atlantic Ocean and try and see if they can find their way to Asia itself, rather than going through what used to be Constantinople, but no longer is, because the Ottomans have now conquered Constantinople and call it Istanbul after 1453. And so we're working down the road of gold. Why the road of gold? And I pause on this. This is worth reading. In another summary, I kind of use this statement from Frankopan over and over again. It's this age of enlightenment, or this empire that's going to be created, focused on Asia, on Europe, especially Northwest Europe. According to Frankopan, is going to be mostly because of violence, and furthermore, that this notion that the Enlightenment, the age of reason, democracy, civil liberties, human rights, all the ideology that in theory the West stands behind as our reason for existence. He says, look, you don't go back to Greece to find that. You sure as heck don't go back to Rome to find that. That is a product of what happens after 1500. And the cause and effect should be put in proper order. That the Enlightenment, democracy, civil rights, all that kind of stuff, that didn't happen as the precursor to becoming a great civilization. It is the aftermath. First you get rich. Later this other stuff becomes part of your ideology. So let's see what he says about that. The Portuguese, they're going to start, Portuguese most sensibly because they're on the Atlantic seaboard. Some of their explorers start creeping down the African coast, seeing if they can, one, discover if there's any way around Africa. And in fact, Diaz will discover that by 1486, I think. But before that, Henry the Navigator is working his way down the African coast. And what does he bump into? He bumps into where that gold has been coming from for more than 2,000 years, from West Africa, across the Sahara Desert, and arriving in Silk Road trade. And now the Portuguese are going to have control of it, because they can transport that gold back to Europe. They also discover, much to their surprise and delight, African slaves that are for sale. And those two things, gold and slaves, are going to be enormous moneymakers for Africa, even before Columbus discovers the so-called New World. And it goes further. If you look at the red circles, the Azore Islands, Madeira Islands, Canary Islands, Cape Verde Islands, those are islands that the Portuguese and later the Spanish will colonize and use African slaves for plantation agriculture. Some of it is sugar, some of it is other stuff, long before there's any plantations in the New World. Well, not long before, but at least 50 years before. So plantation agriculture, which is going to make the North America particularly rich, Brazil rich, is invented by Europeans, Portuguese and Spanish, long before the New World. Well, not again long before, but before the New World discovered. And they get a source of cheap labor, free labor for that matter, black slaves, who of course will be slaughtered in many cases. And if we jump way far forward, just sort of wrap that up as I wish it were a given, but apparently it's not a given. We're not supposed to not be made feel bad by the fact that we're slaves, we're slave owners. For 350 years, 12.5 million Africans, more or less, exploited to the Americas, unpaid labor, mostly plantation agriculture, mining as well. I mean, Europe got enormously rich off of the exploitation of other people. That's got nothing to do with the Declaration of Independence and human rights and all that kind of nonsense. It's pretty widely known. You can Google around and look at this, that a single sugar island like the Barbados, way down just off the coast of the north coast of South America, was worth, in terms of profits, far more than all the 13 colonies of English, fairly deep. And it's even argued, if you look at the bottom paragraph over on the left, some historians will say that's one of the reasons the British lost the colonies. They're spending way too much of their military defending the sugar islands because that's where the money was. And what was that money used for? Well, the first thing it's used for back in merry old England is to build houses and have servants, this time English servants and so forth. But there was still money left over. That money is invested in inventing the Industrial Revolution. And it doesn't come from nowhere. It's got to come from somewhere. And the argument is it comes from really nasty exploitation of black slaves, sugar, and so forth and so forth. Gold and gold. Silver. If it would be a week ago, and some of you weren't even here, but the next to last slide last week was that in 1450, Europe's economy, which was starting to look like it was going somewhere, was hamstrung by the lack of silver. And the reason it was hamstrung by the lack of silver because the silver ended up in China and India, where the good stuff came from. And that had to be solved if you're going to continue on, because you can't be spending all your silver to go somewhere else and have nothing valuable to return in trade. And what's the world? Where's the European world going to get its silver? Well, not surprisingly, in Peru and in Mexico. So Columbus heads off in August. What is today? No, it was yesterday. Columbus Day. How propitious of us. So heads off August 3rd, gets luckier than hell and doesn't end up starving. Bumps into the so-called India, a new continent, on October 12th or whatever. Vasco da Gama himself, 3 years later, no, it was like 6 years later, gets to India. The so-called father of capitalism. I think he would hate that title if he were still alive today. Adam Smith writes tons about the importance of these two major discoveries, Columbus and da Gama. I mean, they changed the world. They give the Europe a head start that will not be closed till recently. This I think we all did learn in elementary school or high school. John Cabot and Columbus and Magellan, blah, blah, blah. But they were all heroes. They were wonderful people. Well, maybe not. As an aside, this slide is worth putting up. As an aside, and also what happens in 1492 is not just that Columbus gets to North America. The Christians finally conquered the very last Islamic holdout in Granada and forced not only Muslims, but Jews to leave. And it's not the first time that Jews have been put upon in Europe, but it gets to be pretty awful after 1492. And you've got this diaspora of Jewish people have to go somewhere. Many of them go to Morocco, as we discovered, Jen and I discovered last year. Another enormous number go to what's now Istanbul and are invited there because the Muslims say, these are people whose skills we want, but that's another story. Silver, for more than 100 years, half of the world's silver comes from a single mine, which is when back then would have been part of Peru, now is in Bolivia, Cerro Rico in the town of Potosi, which at one stage was the fourth largest city in the world because there were so many people there mining silver. I mean, this enormous influx of silver from a single mine, mined all by slaves, some of them Indian, some of them African. The estimates of the deaths are just stunningly high or low. I mean, a low of 2 million, good Lord. I mean, these slaves were put down under the earth for a month at a time. When they were allowed to come up, they were already sick. Just go get some more. So this amount of silver coming into Europe will change the economy, change the philosophy, change the place of Europe in the world scheme of world power, yada, yada, yada. Of course, most of it comes early to Spain because of the Spanish colonies. It's not just this one silver mine in Peru or Bolivia. There's also silver mines, plenty of them in Mexico as well. And this money just pours into Spain. It arrives. Charles V is going to be the emperor of the Holy Roman Emperor. He's also going to be the king of Spain. He's got both titles at the same time. He's got this enormous amount of wealth. And if you look at when his reign begins, 1516, there's something that happens in 1517 that matters. I should have a slide for it. Some of you know, 1517 is when Martin Luther begins the Reformation. And the Reformation is going to lead to holy wars. And Charles V, just loaded with silver, is going to waste an enormous amount of his money on religious wars. The slide to the picture to the right, red is what Charles V inherits. Green, yellow is
Am I the only one not seeing the slides?
oh, you're not seeing the slides? I'm sorry.
No,
I'm not either.
Okay.
I'm not.
Either.
Thank you. Thank you. Don't tell, I don't know why. You couldn't see the slides.
Yeah.
John's collecting things here.
What wonderful slides have we missed?
Oh, you missed all the slides?
We haven't seen any.
Yes.
Oh, no. Okay, well, John just smacked himself in the head.
Well, I did share screen.
Yeah. I'll do it again. And
I'm just retracing it.
sound, options for video clip. Click those down there. Right? Click those down there.
You think?
Yeah. Go ahead and click them and share. Did you press share?
Yes.
Do you see it?
Ah, there they are.
Yes,
You didn't.
and we can see them. They're great. You have to start all over again. Sorry.
Okay, we're gonna go back. We're gonna go back a little bit.
God
Oh,
darn it.
gosh.
There's always something. Now, you're probably seeing two things, but now you should be seeing one thing. Okay?
Yep.
Oh, damn. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Thank you. Can you see slides? Are we okay on slides now? Yes. Thumbs up.
Maybe.
Yes.
Maybe
Yes.
a slide.
A slide. Okay. I'm gonna see if I can, John, I can't go for it. There's the,
Here, you go back that way.
no, we're there.
We're-
There's Potosi. There's the Cerro Rico, half the world's silver in 100 years. That's good enough. We don't have to go too much further back in that. So here's Charles V. He's actually a pretty decent person, but he's a religious, he's Catholic. He can't believe this Protestant stuff. He's going to waste an enormous amount of Spanish wealth coming from the New World. He didn't earn it. The Spanish didn't earn it either. It's earned by slaves on religious wars, which is nuts. It's gonna bankrupt Spain sooner or later. But because the two countries that have gotten a head start, Portugal and Spain, will go to the Pope and say, "Look, we're debating on who owns what. Will you, the Pope, draw a line for us?" And the Pope draws a line right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Says everything to the west is Spanish, everything to the east is Portuguese, which gives Portugal Brazil, fairly cleverly. There's a line, another line over in the Pacific Ocean, which the Portuguese and the Spanish themselves create a treaty on. Like 40 years later, to divide the world completely between Spain and Portugal. I mean, talk about egotistical nonsense. Frankopan will make the point in maybe half an hour, 20 minutes later, that that's pretty much what Europe does after World War I too. Nothing new, dividing up the world to exploit so that the West can rise and become the center of the world for at least a little while. Frankopan is anxious to point out, and does over and over again, that even if that's true, nonetheless, India and China were still doing just fine. Their time of disaster had not arrived yet. The Mughal Empire, which is created by a great-great-grandson of Tamerlane, who claims ancestry to Genghis Khan, in India, thrives for a couple hundred years. It's true the last 100 years is not good, but early on, it's a glorious empire. The same in China, right up until almost 1850. China is thriving and creating most of what the world wants if the world can afford it. After all, China and India alone have got nearly 50% of the world's population at this time period, and way ahead in technology. So it's not, the West is not there as the leader of the world yet. The road to Northern Europe. The theme here in chapter 13 is the Spanish will blow their wealth. They screw up in thousands of ways. The Dutch, in contrast, for a little while, their golden age, will invent what was derisively called state capitalism. That's what Chinese do. Fair people don't do state capitalism. They just compete honestly. What a bunch of horse manure, if one's ever been stated. The so-called state capitalism, where capitalists and inventors will go, entrepreneurs will go out and start corporations and make money, but the state's there to back them up just in case it's a problem. And that what the Dutch invent, the English will copy after their religious civil war is over. Alexander the Hamilton will copy it. If you've seen the musical or anything else for our early revolution, Bismarck will copy it. The Meiji rest, the Japanese will copy it. It's still alive and well in the world. And all this makes the West look like it's the most inventive place on the planet Earth. And to some degree it is, but a huge amount of that wealth is rolling in from overseas brutality, which we tend to not pay attention to if we're telling a kind of an ideological story of the West. The Spanish and the Portuguese simply blow it. I mean, here's Escorial. Many of you have probably visited there. This enormous castle, the biggest Renaissance building just north of Madrid. Philip II, none of this matters. I should shut up and move on. It looks like Spain is running the show, but they blow it. They do all sorts of things wrong. Too much money spent on religious wars, too much money spent on royal palaces, a taxation system which is inefficient, over-focused on the American colonies, blah, blah, blah. And the inflation that is created with all this silver, this unearned silver flowing in, will destroy their manufacturing base, and it moves to Britain. It moves north to Northwest Europe. And this is the Dutch golden age. The Dutch are far ahead of the rest of Europe in inventing what we would recognize as sort of entrepreneurial, middle-class, rich middle-class capitalism. Everyone, people that have money combine their wealth to create a corporation to go out and make more money. But there's always the state there to back them up if things go wrong. And they encourage as many people as possible to invest. The money is spread moderately well across the social spectrum. The Dutch, you get somebody else trying to come in, John. John's going to have to deal with this one because I can't.
But it's Jim Teisel coming back in.
Okay. Okay, I probably can't. Just remember, I can't advance.
Yeah.
What are we gonna do?
Are you ready? Are you ready to?
Yeah. Okay. It is important to note that while we have cute, wonderful pictures of sweet little middle-class people that Vermeer paints, and some nice melancholy pictures from Rembrandt as well, that may have all been true to middle class, sweet and clean, squeaky clean Netherlands, but the money was rolling in from brutality. The Dutch were brutally awful in the Spice Islands, and remained so right up until 1948, 1949, right after World War II, when they tried to go in and take back over Indonesia after World War II. The Dutch dominated the slave trade for a long period of time. The first slaves that came to Jamestown were Dutch. So there's a lot of misery out there in the world that was financing the wealth that flowed into early capitalism in England, in Holland. The English finally get over their religious wars with Cromwell and so forth, and get on with the mercantilism of the navigation. This is just state capitalism. If you're going to trade with us British, you got to ship everything to us first. This is one reason why we had the American Revolution. And the British over time will simply steal much of the Dutch trade. And one thing they steal that is not Dutch, but is Spanish, is the asiento, the exclusive right to transport slaves from Africa to the Latin American colonies. And then Frankopan just jumps forward rather quickly and says, okay, let's talk about the British Empire. The British Empire, the British are going to be on a roll. The money that is pouring into England for a variety of positive reasons, but some of it is just luck. They got the English Channel to protect them from religious wars. They can choose to fight in Europe when they want and choose to not fight when they don't want. And England is going to rule the roost because they are the first with the Industrial Revolution. They get to India as a British corporation, the British East India Company, in 1758. 100 years later, the British government will take over. And Frankopan was to point out, because his book is called The Silk Roads, that this is going to largely be the end of the Silk Roads for a time period at any rate. Because once you're transporting all the goods that were moving across along the Silk Roads for 2,000 years, now you're going to transport them by open ocean, which the British dominate for a little while. The Silk Road trade is going to dry up. I mean, the top picture here is a painting. The bottom picture is an actual picture of the perhaps the most important city on planet Earth, Merv, in the 9th century. And that's what it looks like today. And it's looked like now for 200 or 300 years. It simply dries up and disappears and becomes a ruin. So you're going to get Rule Britannica, a rather self-important theme that you can play and music that you can play and various this is and that. And it's true, Britain is ahead of the world for a while. Why are they ahead of the world? Well, because they control so much of the sea trade. They've got India. India's got opium. That's where the opium is built, is created. And you gotta say that's a pretty impressive picture there on the right. You'd have to admit, I think most people would say, and where's most of that opium going to go? It's going to go to China, because the British were still as late as 1850, or 1830 at least, trying to figure out what can we sell to China to recoup some of the money we're losing buying their silk, buying their porcelain, and so forth and so forth. And the answer is opium.
Looks like an Amazon warehouse.
Yeah, exactly, an Amazon warehouse, early. Yeah, and when there were decent people campaigning against this opium back in England, or the UK, campaigning against this opium sales, and the Royal Commission says, no, this is too valuable. We can't give up on opium.
So it's literally a fulfillment center.
Yeah, there we go. So there was a moment, some of you have never seen this diagram before. Those that have been hanging around with some of us for a couple of years have seen it so many times you want to throw up. But probably a fairly somewhat accurate, partially accurate graph of where the world's wealth was for the last 2,000 years. It is, the horizontal axis is not numerically accurate, but there, about 1850, you can see a quick turn upwards where China and India are going to lose an awful lot of the world's share of wealth. Well, of course they do, because this is when opium trade is going to take over in China, and the West, not just China, not that the British, but the West will fight these opium wars against the Chinese to say, no, no, you can't close your market to us. We want to sell you all the crap we want to sell. And we're going to create the rules by which you buy our stuff, whether you like it or not. And it's in 1857 that the British government takes over in India. It's no longer the British East India Company. And so there's a little while there, tiny little while, frankly, where the West is going to be utterly dominant, British sort of running the show for a while. But the British are going to be challenged, at least in the Silk Roads area, by Russia. Russia, after all, it's Russia that beats Napoleon. It isn't Napoleon's beaten a second time, I'll grant you, in 1815. But by that time, that was sort of a joke. In 1812, they're beaten by Russia, and a rather heroic stand by the Russians. And the Tsar Alexander I is full of himself. Russia is enormous. It's got a lot of people. It's truly backward in some ways, but on the other hand, it's got enormous potential because of natural resources. There's nothing new there, right? You've been talking about that for a while. And Russia is going to challenge the British in Central Asia. There's a map there that, I don't know, John, can you, oh, here. See, the map that is so complicated, we're going to deal much with it. But there's the purple. The purple is is Catherine the Great and Alexander II. And that includes a fair amount of the Ukraine. That's when Russia is going to get control of the Ukraine after a long period of time. And then you go down to the light green, if you want to try and pay attention, in the Caucasus and over in Central Asia. That's when Alexander is going to send troops in and say, let's try and see if we can get as close as we can to India and challenge the British. Russia is on a roll here. Not only do they control what's the lime green, but the dark green is what we now call, well, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so forth. We're the three of us sitting in this room right now are going to go next summer. And Russia gets there. The steppes of Central Asia. Janet and I got to travel through there, and this is somewhere out in the Ukraine, being bombed to hell right these days. Unfortunately, it's not horses, it's sheep. It is something to see if you ever get a chance. Who's going to go there now? Jen and I also got to see the Duriel Pass, where something like several million Russians who were trying to escape being drafted or snuck into Georgia. But that's another stage. So Russia will successfully be able to conquer this now dilapidated part of Central Asia, which for so long, for at least 300, 400, maybe 500 years, was at the very center of world learning and world and world this and that. We got someone trying to make it.
If you haven't muted, somebody's not muted.
Doesn't matter. There's numbers over on the right and left. We don't have time to go over them, but all of what we now call as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so forth, the Russians are going to conquer, and the British take their turn at trying to control this too. The Russians win. They're closer, and they're scared. The British are now scared to death. India is the heart and soul of the colonial empire, and if that were to be challenged, they get a problem. At about the same time, the British are fighting the Boer War in South Africa against the Dutch, who don't want to give up territory, or the former Dutch, who don't want to give up what is now going to be loaded with gold and diamonds. The British will win, but it's a nasty, nasty war with lots of deaths and lots of casualties and lots of misery back home.
The concentration camps.
And concentration camps. The British and other Western empires, other Western colonists are going to be seriously challenged in the Boxer Rebellion in Beijing at the very end of the 19th century. And the West escapes by the skin of their hair, skin of the teeth, whatever we call it, I don't know. The British are feeling that like they're mainly on the ropes. And Frankopan was to point out this, for many of this was kind of a revelation, that it's at that stage of panic over Russian power that the British foreign policy experts, Sir Edward Grey and so forth, will say, we've got to divert Russia's attention away from Asia. And here's the plan. We go to Russia and say, whatever policies you've got regarding Europe, we will not stand in your way. We would like to be your ally, as a matter of fact. And we understand what this means. We're going to create an enemy with Germany who's already PO'd at us anyway. But Gray is able to achieve the Anglo-Russian alliance, which will follow only a couple of years behind the Franco-Anglo, the French and British alliance, which is an enormous change in diplomacy in Europe. Actually, the British and French have been enemies for 600 years. And all this happens just as the possibility of World War I is going to happen. Frankopan will say with some power, I say, look, the British were willing to sacrifice this hostility with Germany to get Russia on their side. And there's some quotes over on the left, not going to read them. If we had more time, you read the book, whatever. One after another saying, we cannot alienate Russia. We cannot alienate Russia. This is the British saying that. And so you have an alliance system set up prior to World War I, where people like Friedrich Engels and lots of leftists say, it's coming. There's going to be a grand war here. It's just inevitable. And there's a lot of poo-pahing that, oh, come on. We've had peace almost since the Napoleonic revolutions. It's been 150 years, 115 years of peace, or 100 years of peace. We're not going to have a war. The leftists are right. And World War I happens. And it's, of course, rather devastating. Why were Engels and others leftists so anxious so willing to, able to see this? Because their ideology had it more or less right, that the West was so full of competition regarding the resources of the world, whether it was gold or silver before. Now it was oil. The British got there first, but others wanted it too. The competition was so severe to get these natural resources that sooner or later, the fighting that was farmed out to other parts of the planet were going to come home to roost in Europe. And sure enough, it did. So that I should go back. If you want to take a couple cracks at a couple chapters, these chapters for many of us was quite a revelation, where the British will get to Iranian oil first by pure luck, and eventually that becomes British Petroleum. It takes a little while before the name of and for quite a while the British simply say, we'll give you the Iranians a tiny little bit of the profits. Most of it is ours, more or less like Spain did with Spain and Portugal did with the gold and silver coming from the New World. And Frankopan will say, all that would still continued on, but you can see it happening after World War I. The era of Western Europe, Western Europe's dominance of the planet was in retreat. That if you see that graphic, that is an intended map of what the Ottoman Empire would look like after World War I, according to British and French sitting at Versailles. And the Turks said, nonsense, we're not accepting that. And basically restarted World War I. This is Ataturk. He's got an army that's still loyal to him. Pretty much restarts World War I and said, we will not accept that peace treaty. And 3 years later, the Europeans say, okay, we get your point. And that's the map we end up with that looks somewhat familiar to today. That's because Europe is not in control anymore in much of the world. The other parts of the world are saying, these are paper tigers. Look at the mess they caused in their own continent in World War I. And there's a lot to say about that map and how it's dysfunctional and this and that, but it's at least somewhat familiar to us. The last chapters that we'll deal with, and how are we doing with time? We're getting close, aren't we? Lyco's supposed to be telling me.
10 minutes.
We got 10 minutes, okay, yeah. The last chapters we'll deal with before cutting this off and saying, well, okay, what challenges you got, what questions you got. Frankopan. Okay, we're gonna live that. We're not gonna. I'm not living that one down for a while. Frankopan. Frankopan will say, so look, the story is not